Hey guys, how are you today? Quick rant before we dive into today's chaos. As some of you might have noticed, YouTube's algorithm has decided I'm not special anymore. Shocking, I know. So now if you don't like, comment, or do a little backflip in the algorithm's honor, this video might just vanish into the void, never to be seen again. Seriously though, even a hi or "this is wild" in the comments helps way more than you think. It tells YouTube, hey, people actually like this channel. Maybe don't hide it from everyone. That can really help push my videos out to a wider audience, not just to my subscribers. So if you enjoy these stories and want to support the channel, that's the best way to do it. Now grab a drink, get comfy, and enjoy the drama. You won't want to miss this one. When my husband suggested that his sister move in with us, I hesitated. I was 7 months pregnant, tired, and already stressed about preparing for the baby. Adding another person to our small home seemed like the last thing we needed. But when he explained her situation, how she'd lost her apartment and couldn't keep up with rent, I found it hard to say no. She was family after all. I told myself it would only be temporary. At first, it wasn't so bad. She moved in with a few bags, mostly clothes, and her laptop. She promised she'd only stay for a couple of months, just until she could get back on her feet. She said she'd help around the house, contribute when she could, and wouldn't be a bother. I believed her because I wanted to. The red flags started small. Within the first week, she had spread her things throughout the living room, turning it into her personal space. Her excuse was that the spare bedroom was too small to hold all her stuff. I bit my tongue and moved some of my baby things to make room. She would sit on the couch all day, scrolling through her phone or binge-watching TV shows, and somehow I was the one cooking dinner for everyone every night. I brought it up with my husband one evening while we were getting ready for bed. I told him that I felt like his sister wasn't really trying to improve her situation, that she wasn't even looking for a job. He brushed it off, saying she was just stressed and needed time to decompress. Give her a break. He said, she's been through a lot. I wanted to believe he was right, so I let it go. But as the weeks turned into months, her behavior didn't change. She stopped pretending to look for work altogether. Whenever I tried to talk to her about contributing to the household, she would get defensive, claiming she was too overwhelmed to focus on anything but surviving. My pregnancy wasn't easy. I was dealing with swollen feet, back pain, and endless appointments, but I still managed to keep the house running. Meanwhile, she left her dirty dishes in the sink and her laundry piled up in the bathroom. Every time I asked for help, she'd sigh dramatically and say she was too tired. It wasn't just the physical mess she created. It was the emotional strain too. She'd make passive-aggressive comments about how lucky I was to have a husband who supported me, and how she wished she could just stay at home like I did. She acted like being pregnant was some sort of luxury, completely ignoring how much work it took to keep things together. I brought it up with my husband again, hoping he'd see my side this time. He listened, but his response was frustratingly neutral. He said he understood how I felt, but he also pointed out that his sister had nowhere else to go. What do you want me to do? Throw her out on the street? His words stung, because I'd never suggested that. I just wanted her to pull her weight and respect the fact that this was our home, not hers. But I didn't push the issue. I told myself I could handle it, and that things would get better once the baby arrived. When the baby finally came, I felt like my world shifted in the best way possible. Holding my little one for the first time made every ache, every sleepless night worth it. I thought maybe the joy of having a new life in the house would soften my sister-in-law's attitude. I was wrong. The first week home from the hospital, the baby cried non-stop. It was exhausting, but I expected that. What I didn't expect was for her to bang on our bedroom door at 2 o'clock in the morning, yelling that she couldn't sleep. Can you shut that baby up already? Some of us have work to do in the morning. Work? She didn't even have a job. I was too tired to argue, so I focused on soothing the baby instead. But her complaints didn't stop. Every time the baby cried, she'd groan loudly or make snide remarks about how inconsiderate we were. She even started blaming the baby for her inability to find a job, claiming she couldn't concentrate on applications because of all the noise. I tried to keep the peace, but it was becoming impossible. I felt like a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around her moods while trying to care for a newborn. She had no problem voicing her frustrations, but whenever I tried to talk to her about it, she'd play the victim. I told my husband we needed to set boundaries. I explained how her behavior was affecting me and the baby. He nodded along, but didn't take any real action. He said he'd talk to her, but I never saw him follow through. The final straw came one evening when she sat us down for a family discussion. She said she wanted to address the baby situation and how it was impacting her mental health. She claimed she couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, and couldn't find any peace with a baby crying at all hours. I was stunned when she suggested that I and the baby move in with my parents for a few months until things settle down. She said it as if it were the most reasonable solution in the world, like it was my responsibility to accommodate her comfort. I looked at my husband, expecting him to shut her down, but he hesitated. He said he understood where she was coming from and suggested that it might not be a bad idea to consider her proposal. My heart sank. After everything I'd been through, carrying our child, giving birth, and trying to hold our family together, this was his solution. To send me and our baby away so his sister could have a quiet house. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I felt betrayed, angry, and heartbroken all at once. It was clear that something had to change. And I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself and my baby, no one else would. That night, as I held my sleeping baby in my arms, I made a decision. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about creating a safe and loving environment for my child, free from the toxicity that had taken over our home. If my sister-in-law couldn't respect that, then she didn't deserve to stay under our roof. And if my husband couldn't see that, then he'd have to face the consequences of his own choices. It was time to reclaim my home and my peace, no matter what it took. Not the a-hole. She's a tenant, not a house guest, and a disrespectful one at that. The minute she pounded on OP's door at 2 a.m., demanding a newborn be quiet, she forfeited any right to grace. OP's husband needs to graduate from neutral to protective boundaries, written house rules, chore split, curfew for noise, and a firm move-out date. 30 days max. And now let's hear community's opinion. Your sister-in-law is freeloading, but the real problem is your husband outsourcing backbone. What do you want me to do? Throw her out? Number. You want him to choose his nuclear family. He can help his sister without sacrificing his wife and newborn. Couples counseling plus a united script. You can stay until X date. You must contribute money. Chores and disrespect gets you out sooner. Honestly, you've been way too patient. She's not a guest in crisis anymore. She's a grown adult taking advantage of your kindness. The second she suggested you and your newborn should move out, that was pure entitlement. Pack her bags, hand them to your husband, and tell him she leaves by the weekend. If he hesitates, he can go with her. You don't negotiate basic respect in your own home. You just gave birth. Your body is healing. Sleep is a survival resource. Anyone who adds stress instead of support is a risk factor. Her mental health doesn't trump your postpartum needs. You're not heartless for protecting your peace. You're a mom doing her job, not the a-hole, and good on you for deciding to reclaim your home. Update. 4 days later, after the outrageous suggestion that I and the baby should move out, I knew I couldn't let things slide any longer. The tension in the house was unbearable, and my patience had run out. My husband tried to act as though nothing had happened, brushing past the conversation like it wasn't the betrayal it felt like. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law strutted around the house like she'd won some kind of victory, barely acknowledging me or the baby. I stayed quiet that night, not because I agreed with either of them, but because I needed time to gather my thoughts. I wasn't going to react out of raw emotion. This time, I was going to make sure my voice was heard. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I sat down with my husband. The baby was napping, and I told him we needed to talk. I said that his sister's behavior had gone too far, and that his support for the absolute rubbish she spewed the night before, it hurt me deeply. I warned him that this was our home, our family, and I deserved his support. He tried to downplay it, saying his sister wasn't thinking straight, and that I was overreacting. He said I needed to be more understanding considering her difficult situation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him that I had been more than understanding. I had let her move in when I was 7 months pregnant, cooked for her, cleaned up after her, and tolerated her laziness for months. I had swallowed her passive-aggressive comments, her complaints about the baby, and her complete disregard for my feelings, but suggesting that I leave my home. That was the line. He looked uncomfortable, but I pressed on. I said that if he didn't have the courage to stand up to her, then I would. I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel like an outsider in my own house. And I certainly wasn't going to let anyone put my baby's needs second to their own. I could see the guilt creeping into his expression. But before he could say anything, the baby woke up crying. As I went to tend to her, I told him that we'd finish this conversation later and that he needed to think long and hard about whose side he was really on. Later that afternoon, I decided it was time to confront his sister directly. She was sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if she didn't have a care in the world. I stood in front of her, blocking the TV, and told her we needed to talk. She rolled her eyes and asked what it was now, in the most dismissive tone imaginable. I stayed calm, even though my anger was bubbling just beneath the surface. I told her that her behavior had been unacceptable, and that her suggestion that I and the baby move out was not only disrespectful, but outrageous. She shrugged and said she was just trying to come up with a solution that worked for everyone. She claimed she needed her sleep to get her life back on track, and that she couldn't do that with a crying baby in the house. I stared at her in disbelief. I asked her if she even realized how selfish she sounded. I told her that this was my home, and the baby was my priority. If she couldn't handle a little noise, then maybe she should be the one looking for somewhere else to stay. That struck a nerve. She sat up and started raising her voice, saying she had nowhere else to go and that I was being unfair. She accused me of trying to make her feel like a burden, when all she wanted was a little peace and quiet. I didn't back down. I told her that she was a burden because she refused to take any responsibility for her own life. I reminded her that she promised to stay temporarily to contribute to the household and to help out, but she had done none of those things. I said that I had been more than generous, but my kindness had limits and she had reached them. Her face turned red and she started sputtering, but I didn't give her a chance to interrupt. I told her that if she didn't like the noise, she was free to leave at any time. At that moment, my husband walked in, probably drawn by the raised voices. He looked between us, clearly unsure of what to do. His sister immediately started playing the victim, saying I was kicking her out when she had nowhere else to go. I turned to him and said that this wasn't about her having nowhere to go. It was about her complete lack of respect for me, our home, and our baby. I told him that if he couldn't see that, then he was just as much of a problem as she was. For the first time, I saw something click in his expression. He looked at his sister and said that she needed to apologize and start pulling her weight if she wanted to stay. She exploded, yelling that she didn't deserve to be treated like this, that she was family, and that we were supposed to support each other. I snapped. I told her that my family didn't treat each other the way she had treated me. Family didn't make you feel unwelcome in your own home, or suggest that you leave with a newborn. I said that if she couldn't appreciate what I had already done for her, then she didn't deserve any more of my patience or kindness. I told her she had 1 week to find another place to stay. She stared at me, stunned, as if she couldn't believe I had actually stood up to her. My husband tried to intervene, saying we needed to calm down and talk things through, but I cut him off. I told him that I had done enough talking and that this was non-negotiable. If he wanted to keep enabling her behavior, then he could leave with her. The room fell silent. For a moment, I thought he might actually take her side, but then he sighed and said he understood where I was coming from. He turned to his sister and told her that she needed to respect my decision. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there shaking with a mixture of anger and relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I had regained some control over my own life. That night, as I rocked the baby to sleep, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. I knew the next week wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that I had done the right thing. It was time to take back my home and put my family first. Update 2. 15 days later, the morning after the confrontation, the tension in the house was thicker than ever. My sister-in-law avoided me like the plague, sulking in her room and refusing to come out even for meals. My husband, clearly torn between his sister and me, tried to stay neutral, but the guilt on his face was unmistakable. I wasn't going to let him coast through this without accountability. I cornered him in the kitchen after breakfast, while the baby was napping. I asked him if he realized how much damage his silence had caused. I told him I felt abandoned, that I had been left to fight battles alone in my own home while he stood on the sidelines. He looked down at his coffee, avoiding my gaze. He said that he didn't know what to do, that he felt stuck between me and his sister. He said that she had always been the fragile one in the family, and that he felt responsible for her well-being, especially after her life fell apart. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him that while it was admirable to care for his sister, it wasn't his job to let her walk all over me to make her feel better. I reminded him that I was his wife, the mother of his child, and that I deserved to feel safe and respected in my own home. I told him that if he couldn't prioritize me and the baby, then maybe he didn't deserve to be a part of our family. That seemed to hit a nerve. He finally looked up at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. He said that he didn't want to lose me or the baby, and that he would try harder to support me. But he asked me to give his sister some time to process everything before she left. I reluctantly agreed, but only because I knew her time was limited regardless. She had 1 week, and I wasn't going to extend it. Later that day, I overheard her on the phone in her room. She was venting to someone, probably a friend, about how unfairly she was being treated. She painted herself as the victim, saying that I was throwing her out with nowhere to go. She complained about the baby crying and how she couldn't get a decent night's sleep, conveniently leaving out the part where she suggested I move out instead. I stood outside her door, fuming. It took every ounce of restraint I had not to barge in and set the record straight. Instead, I walked away and started making plans. Over the next few days, I began to reclaim my home. I packed up her things and neatly placed them in boxes in the spare room. I didn't want her to have any excuse to linger when her time was up. My husband noticed but didn't say anything, probably knowing better than to question me. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law's behavior became increasingly unbearable. She went out of her way to make life difficult, leaving dishes in the sink, blasting the TV late at night, and slamming doors whenever the baby cried. It was as if she wanted to punish me for daring to stand up to her. I didn't let it get to me. Every time she acted out, it only strengthened my resolve. I reminded myself that this was temporary, that in a matter of days, she would be gone and peace would return to my home. Finally, the week came to an end. That morning, I knocked on her door and told her it was time for her to leave. She glared at me, but didn't argue. She probably knew there was no point. She gathered her things in silence, shooting daggers at me with her eyes every time she walked past. My husband helped her load her belongings into the car. He looked conflicted, but I didn't care. This wasn't about him or his sister anymore. This was about me and my baby and the life we deserve to have. And no, I won't say our baby. He hasn't done ST for her. As she drove away, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The weight I had been carrying for months was finally lifted. I turned to my husband and told him that this was a new beginning for us, but only if he was willing to step up and put our family first. He nodded and said he understood. He apologized for not standing by me sooner and promised to do better. I told him that I would hold him to that promise because I wasn't going to tolerate being treated as an afterthought ever again. That evening, as I rocked the baby to sleep, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. My home was quiet, and my baby was happy. Update 3. 10 days later, a week after my sister-in-law left, the house finally started to feel like a home again. The baby was sleeping better, I was sleeping better, and even my husband seemed to be trying harder to make things right. He'd been attentive and apologetic, although I could tell he was still struggling with his feelings about his sister. That's why when I heard the familiar sound of her voice outside my door one afternoon, I couldn't believe my ears. I froze for a moment, thinking I must have misheard. But no. There she was, standing next to my husband, suitcase in hand, acting like she was entitled to waltz back into my house. I opened the door and stared at them, disbelief quickly giving way to anger. I asked my husband what on earth he thought he was doing. He had the nerve to tell me that he couldn't leave his sister with nowhere to go, and that she promised she wouldn't cause any more trouble. He said that since the baby had been sleeping better, it wouldn't be such a big deal to let her stay for a while longer. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made both of them flinch. I told him there was no way in hell she was stepping foot inside my house again. I reminded him that we had agreed. No, I had decided that she was gone for good. My sister-in-law had the audacity to roll her eyes and mutter under her breath about how I was overreacting. That was it. I told them both to stay put and slammed the door in their faces. I called my in-laws immediately. I needed reinforcements. When my father-in-law picked up, I didn't hold back. I told him everything, how his daughter had suggested I move out of my own home with a newborn, how she had made my life a living hell, and how my husband had stood by and done nothing. He was silent for a moment, then asked if his son was with her. I said yes. They were both standing outside my house like stray cats looking for a handout. He said he was on his way. While I waited, my husband knocked on the door, asking me to let them in so they could explain. I shouted through the door that there was nothing to explain and that he'd better hope his father got here before I called mine. 15 minutes later, my in-laws arrived. My mother-in-law looked furious, but my father-in-law seemed calm. Too calm. He approached my husband and asked him what he was thinking. My husband tried to explain, saying he just wanted to help his sister and didn't think it would be such a big deal. His father cut him off, saying that this wasn't about his sister anymore. This was about the blatant disrespect he'd shown me and our child. My sister-in-law started whining, saying it wasn't fair and that she was the one who needed support. My father-in-law told her to be quiet, saying she had already caused enough damage. Then he turned back to my husband and asked if he had even considered how his actions might affect me. The woman who had just given birth to his child and was supposed to be his priority. Before my husband could respond, I called my own father. I didn't care if it escalated the situation. I needed someone in my corner. He arrived within 20 minutes, his face a storm cloud of rage. The moment he stepped out of his car, he demanded to know what was going on. My father-in-law, to his credit, didn't try to sugarcoat anything. He told my father everything, apologizing for his son's behavior and saying he was ashamed of how things had turned out. My father, never one to mince words, told my husband that he didn't deserve to call himself a husband or a father. He said that if my husband cared so much about his sister, then maybe he should move out with her and leave me to raise the baby in peace. The rest of the family was more than happy to help raise her. My husband started pleading, saying he was sorry and that he just wanted to do the right thing for everyone. My father-in-law cut him off, saying that he'd already done enough and that it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. Together, my father and father-in-law went inside and started packing up my husband's things. My husband followed them, begging them to stop, but neither of them paid him any attention. My sister-in-law tried to step in, saying it wasn't fair, but my mother-in-law pulled her back and told her to shut her mouth for once in her life. My sill looked like a scared wet cat in front of them. The bravado now melted away. By the time they were done, all of my husband's belongings were packed up and piled on the front lawn. My father-in-law turned to my husband and told him to take his circus act and his sister and find somewhere else to stay. He said he wasn't going to enable their behavior anymore. He said if they had found out about it earlier, then he would have dragged them both out. My husband dropped to his knees, begging for forgiveness. He said he didn't want to lose his family and that he would do anything to make things right. My father-in-law shook his head and told him that he had made his choice and now he had to live with it. My husband and his sister crammed into her beat-up car with their belongings piled high in the back. My father stayed for a while, holding the baby and reassuring me that I had done the right thing. He said that I was stronger than I realized and that I didn't need anyone who couldn't see my worth. My father-in-law apologized again, saying he wished he had stepped in sooner. I told him that it wasn't his fault and that I appreciated his support now. I sat in the nursery rocking my baby to sleep. I whispered to her that everything was going to be okay, that we didn't need anyone who couldn't put us first. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my husband, make me feel this pathetic ever again. Edit. The house is rented. We didn't sign a contract because it belonged to one of my father's close family friends. Update 4. 1 week later, 2 days after the confrontation, my husband showed up at the house. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled, and he had a desperate energy about him that immediately set me on edge. I opened the door just enough to block his line of sight and asked him what he wanted. He said he had been staying at a friend's house, thinking about everything that had happened. He admitted he had made mistakes and that he deeply regretted everything. He said he didn't know why he let his sister get to him, and that he should have stood by me instead of giving in to her demands. His voice cracked as he begged me to give him another chance, promising that he would never let anyone come between us again. I stood there for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. Then I told him that I had made a decision too. I said that I would be filing for divorce. The shock on his face was almost enough to make me hesitate, but I kept going. I told him that his behavior over the past few months had shown me who he really was. I couldn't trust him to put our family first, and I couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering when he would let someone else undermine me again. He looked like I had just hit him. He said he didn't want a divorce, and that we could work things out if I just gave him a chance. I told him that chances were for people who showed remorse before things escalated to this point. I reminded him that he had stood by while his sister treated me like a nobody in my own home, all while I was recovering from childbirth and trying to take care of our baby. I asked him how he thought I could ever feel safe or valued with him after that. I told him that I had been keeping quiet because I didn't want to escalate things. I hadn't told his parents or mine about what was going on because I thought I could handle it on my own. I realize now that was a very stupid decision. If I had spoken up sooner, maybe things wouldn't have gotten so out of hand. I admitted that part of me had been embarrassed to admit how bad things had gotten, especially after I had invited his sister into our home out of pity. I knew his sister had a strained relationship with her parents. She had run away from home when she was 16 and had barely kept in touch over the years. I had thought that letting her stay with us might help mend some of those old wounds, but I could see now that it had only made things worse. Our parents hadn't been around much since the baby was born, because after a lot of discussion, we had agreed to limit visitors for the first month to keep things safe for the baby. Everyone respected that boundary, assuming that everything was fine in our household. I told him that I had thought we were on the same page, but now I realized I had been wrong. He tried to bring up the delivery room, saying that he had been there for me when it mattered most. I reminded him that he had fainted halfway through and spent more time being tended to by the nurses than actually supporting me. I said I wasn't blaming him for that child. Birth is intense, but he couldn't use that as a defense for everything else he had done wrong since. I told him that I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. I said that I needed to focus on myself and the baby, and that meant cutting out anything and anyone that brought unnecessary stress into our lives. He asked if there was anything he could do to change my mind, but I told him it was too late. He left eventually, still pleading with me to reconsider, but I stayed firm. I should have set boundaries sooner. I should have spoken up the first time his sister crossed the line, but hindsight is always 2020.